Welcome to our critical issues confronting China. This will be our last session before the holidays. We'll resume late in January. And we're very fortunate to have with us Jim Millward, who on the Xinjiang question has distinguished himself both as a historian who's been working on the issues for a long time with a lot of general background in Qing history, great linguist, who not only does work in Chinese, but also in Japanese, reads Russian and Spanish, and keeps up with all those issues. After he was an undergraduate at Harvard and he stayed in languages, he went on to Stanford where he for many years. He worked on Qing history, and he's been working on Xinjiang for a long time. Some people have said that his Eurasian Crossroads is still he's written a more recent book on the Silk Road and a number of other important books in between. He's often now quoted in issues related to Xinjiang because he's kept up with the issue, very passionate in defending Uyghur intellectuals. And so we're very fortunate that considering how important the issue is, how much he's in demand and how much the Uyghur issue is on the front burner, the Uyghur issue has been a very sensitive one for a long time. In 2004, a group of historians working in Xinjiang combined to write a book edited by Frederick Starr. And already all the people who have been working on that, and some very distinguished scholars, including John Lippmann and Gardner, many others, have all had trouble getting into Xinjiang ever since that time. So amidst all this great difficulty, Jim has kept up his scholarship, kept up his informing, and so we're very pleased that he took the time to be with us. Jim, it's yours.
Thank you very much.
If I could just, excuse me, Professor Millward, if I could just jump in real quick.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry,
questions.
Yeah.
It did, because I assume people will have plenty of questions. The way to do it is to enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you want to identify yourself, please put your name and your institution so we know where you're coming from. And then if you don't, there's an anonymous question function. All right, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Ezra, and thanks to the Fairbanks Center for having me. I know Ezra was trying to get me to come speak about Xinjiang at the center for many years now, and I always said no because I didn't have anything new to say. I'd sort of written my book, and there were other people coming along. Unfortunately, now there's just so much to talk about for kind of the wrong reasons that I couldn't say no. So
thank you.
For whatever reasons, it is nice to be able to, I guess I can say, return to Harvard and to speak about this. And then what I'll try to do today is to put some historical perspective and kind of try and explain from a longer point of view what's going on now and why I think it's going on now and what the problems are. So I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen and pull that up. All right, so that's visible, right, again, Ezra?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay, all right. So I won't spend a lot of time on sort of going over what's been happening there in Xinjiang since the last 4 or 5 years, or yeah, I guess since 2016, 2017 or so. I think everyone here is well aware. You can kind of break it down into the surveillance regime, into the arrests and internments. And I say arrests and internments because a lot of the media attention has been on these camps, which have been the system of camps, which has been built out since 2017. But along with that, and very much part of the same system, have been people put into prisons at a unprecedented rate, including a lot of intellectuals and so on. the birth suppression campaign via the family planning policies, but which are aggressively enacted and pursued in Xinjiang while they're actually being retreated from in many ways in Han regions of the PRC. Recently, most in the news has been the issue of forced labor or non-voluntary labor in factories involving sending of people from southern and other parts of Xinjiang to factories are all around Xinjiang and even in eastern China. In many ways, family separations, both because of internments and arrests, because of sending people to remote factories to work, because of the boarding school system, all really amounts to an attack on the family, and much more broadly, an ongoing assault on Uyghur culture, cultural patrimony, the Uyghur language, and so on. So, all of these things really come together to a situation which is increasingly being talked about as genocide or ethnocide or cultural genocide, certainly crimes against humanity, and certainly things that we really wish we weren't talking about in regard to the People's Republic of China in the year 2020. So this paragraph here kind of pulls together what I'm trying to say in this talk. We're looking at something right now that really is unprecedented, but not unrelated to the trajectories of both development and assimilationist or ethnic policies in Xinjiang by the CCP over the years. There's been a heightening of the assimilationist part of that, an abandoning of pluralist approaches to diversity, at least cultural diversity or cultural autonomy in favor of outright assimilation. And of course, this has been justified in the name of counterterrorism and also increasingly poverty alleviation. So I won't read this out to you. Hopefully you have been able to skim it while I've been talking, but that's sort of the general points. And I will say, if anyone's interested, I can make available a PDF version of my slides. And I have actually a much longer version, which has links to a lot of studies and news accounts and stuff. So I don't have time to kind of go into all the sourcing about what we're talking about today, but I can provide the PDF, which has all that information in it through, I guess, the Fairbanks Center. All right. So I'm not going to linger on this next set of slides, but I did want to sort of simply point this out because this is, again, the issue about imprisonment through the legal system, such as it is, as opposed to the extra legal internments, which have gotten most of the attention. And so this is all from Chinese sources, statistical yearbooks, judicial sources, and so on, gathered and collated by various groups. And you can see that in 2017, suddenly the number of people going through the legal system and being imprisoned in Xinjiang went from a baseline of like 27,000 or so in previous years, suddenly up to over 200,000. And then with another additional increase of 360,000 in the next year. The 2019 figures are roughly comparable. They haven't been tabulated into a graph. Unfortunately, I don't have them here. So we're talking about this mass imprisonment as well as the camps. And of course, this is how we got to know about what was going on. We suddenly could see from websites all of the allocation of funding, the tenders for bids to build out the security system. Echoing that same trend in a really kind of terrifying way, you see, this is just from the Bureau of Khotan in the south. You see this sudden uptick in building of Yuan, right? So it's kindergarten, but it's for children from as young as, I guess, 18 months up through kind of lower school. Suddenly see new facilities needed to house children because their parents were taken away. There's been a lot of work, including by Ryan Thum, a Harvard PhD himself, about the destruction of architecture, in particular dome and minaret gateways on mosques, and in many places whole mosques. This has been going on for some years, and we can find it again quite easily through before and after satellite photos. there's been a really full-scale attack on the Uyghur language, in particular the script in which it's written. Uyghur publications, they're no longer being books published in Uyghur. The textbook system in the what's called bilingual education, which is actually Han medium education with a Uyghur language and culture class. A new set of textbooks were rolled out starting around 2010. And their old Uyghur texts that had been, examples of old Uyghur writing were replaced with old Chinese writing, that is old Chinese, Wenyan materials translated into Uyghur. That's just one example. And then here in this banner poster outside of a school in Urumqi in 2018, you can probably figure out what it would be, right? It says Nin Hao on the left, Romanization, and Chinese for hello. And then on the right, it also has Yakshimsiz, which is a Romanization. And it would have been the Uyghur script above it, Yakshimsiz as well, but that's been literally cut out of the poster in 2018. And that's just emblematic of this kind of erasure across the board. You may have read about the anti-halal movement in Xinjiang, but also in Northwest China and other places where you could no longer write halal in Arabic script on restaurants. It's a similar anti-Arab script kind of movement. And then the forced labor issue, which I'll actually be talking about a little bit more later. All right, so I think it's really, and I'm guilty of perhaps not using the word colonial that much before. I haven't entirely eschewed it, but I haven't made it front and center simply because it raises hackles so much. But I think at this point it really is worthwhile examining the colonial nature of Xinjiang, both within the Qing Empire and within the republics, the Chinese republics in the 20th century. And there's a perennial problem which is still with us. This is something I pointed out in my first book, Beyond the Pass, that Xinjiang was managed through huge central government subsidies, or actually through huge subsidies coming from Eastern China. The way the Qing did it is they made individual rich provinces directly finance Xinjiang by sending silver overland themselves. They didn't take it from the Qing treasury. But this was always necessary to subsidize the maintenance of control in the region. And from the beginning, there was an effort to mitigate some of those costs by investing in settlements, agricultural development for Han and Hui coming from Northwest China, also for some Manchu or Solon and Shibo peoples in the north. Mongols were settled there on state farms and state pastoral organizations. But this was combined in the Qing, as the new Qing history has talked about a lot, with a pluralist approach to administration, Mongol princes ruling Mongols, Uyghur begs and Hakim begs in charge of Uyghur regions, and so on. Excuse me. And there were, in fact, strong restrictions on Han settlement in southern Xinjiang. This is very much a part of policy, which was maintained through the 1830s. So that was, sort of the initial Qing approach to this issue. And then Gong Zizhen, in a famous essay on making Xinjiang a province in 1820, and this was kind of a policy paper that he wrote after a series of border incursions in the Kashgar area, so in the early 1800s. And he said the solution to this was to make Xinjiang a province. So Xingsheng was the term. Now that was really a coded way of saying, put Xinjiang under the Han style, that is Junxian style administration, not under Uyghurs and Manchus and Mongols and so on, but make it a province like Sichuan, say. And in doing so, investing in agriculture, moving Han out there to grow crops, thereby raising the tax base. And of course, there was an assumption there that Han would be better at farming than the Xinjiang natives would be. And of course, it is unbalanced and assimilationist strategy, which had this ethnic edge, which also actually impinged upon or kind of challenged Manchu governance in the peripheries. And so it was politically untenable in 1820. But after the big rebellion, the Hui rebellion in Gansu area that spread out into Xinjiang, Zhuo Zongtang, and then actually the first governor of Xinjiang, Liu Jintang, they came up, really suggested the same sorts of things. First of all, famously, Zhuo suggested that Xinjiang should be reconquered and shouldn't be left. It belonged part of the empire, and so that was the first big investment. But then it would be followed up, he argued, by Han settlement, agricultural development, transport development. He planted rows of willow trees along the roads and set up water depots. Some of those willows, or their continuation, were still visible in the 20th century, in order to integrate the region, and again to make it bloom, increase the tax base, and thereby make it secure. This was the idea. And then under Zhuo and Liu Jintang, in these first post-reconquest periods, they implemented efforts at Confucian education in Confucian academies for a really very small number of Uyghur elites. But Eric Schlussel has written about this recently as well. And it wasn't terribly successful. They gave these Uyghur students Chinese names. All of us who've studied Chinese have had the experience of it being given a Chinese name. Sometimes they can be quite ideological. One of the Chinese names given to a Uyghur boy in this system that I encountered in the archives was Ai Du Shu, loves to read books, was the name that they gave to his name was began with an A consonant. So in any case, we see here what Zhou and Lin were trying to do here. And ultimately, Xinjiang was made a sheng. There was this big administrative remake of the region. And not entirely, but a beginnings of a move away from Qing-style pluralist administration to a more Han focused. And so the officials who came in, the governor in Urumqi and so on, they were thereafter Han. There was still a general in the north, a Jiang Jun, who would be a Manchu for a while. All right, so that's sort of the deeper history. I'm going to jump ahead, though, to the PRC period, so that we can talk more about sort of the contemporary issues. So I would say that the Chinese Communist Party does have a colonial problem in Xinjiang or in the Uyghur region, and that problem begins with not admitting it's a colonial problem. I asked one of my younger colleagues who works a lot on decolonial studies or post-colonial studies, and of course there's a very vast literature which I don't claim to have read very much of, and it gets quite theoretical sometimes. But I was asking, what's the difference between studying colonialism and post-colonialism? And her response was, well, you first have to recognize that there was colonialism before you can get into the post-colonial kind of period. So I think that's what we're sort of facing here. Xinjiang remains expensive to rule in that it continually absorbs subsidies from the central government and now, as I'll mention in a moment, from other provinces and rich cities of the East, just as in the Qing period. It has a non-Chinese native population that is persistently still non-Chinese, although I would argue that that not losing one's identity as a Uyghur does not mean one cannot be a good PRC citizen, obviously, right? And there are, in fact, there was at least a flourishing Uyghur middle class. The idea that Uyghurs don't speak Chinese across the board is completely untrue, and so on and so forth. So there has been plenty of adoption to and acceptance of life in China by the Uyghurs, but at the same time they haven't given up cultural Islam or even a religious faith in Islam or many of the other characteristics of being being Uyghur or Kazakh or Kyrgyz and so on. But of course, one problem that has emerged over the past decades has been that ratcheting up of pressure, I'm calling it repression, ratcheting up of that tends to produce more resistance or more, or at least more acts of resistance, which then produces more broad spread repression. And then we get into this kind of a cycle. And I think if you simply look back over the past decades in Xinjiang, it's really very easy to see that cycle working. And then right now we've seen, and all along, but in particular recently, attempts to deal with these problems, I say by putting forward a false historical narrative, and saying Xinjiang has been part of China since the Han Dynasty. And the reason I say that that's an attempt to address the problem is because with recent international criticism of the policies in the Uyghur region, one of the first official responses, the very first response was to deny that the camps existed. And then the next one was to argue that they were vocational training centers. But right along that time, the PRC rolled out another white paper, which began with this narrative about the Han Dynasty. And we've seen the mayor of Urumqi has written or published an op-ed saying that Uyghurs are not Turks, they're not descended from the Turkic Khaganate. There have been academics sucking up to authorities by writing papers, linguistic papers that purport to show that Uyghur is actually derived from the Chinese language. It's not a Altaic language. So this attempt to write a narrative that writes this region in and denies its Central Asian character and history, it's reached really ridiculous extremes right now. And yet that's a knee-jerk response to this kind of criticism. Well, Xinjiang belongs to China, right? Stop repressing the minorities of Xinjiang. The response one gets very often is Xinjiang belongs to China, right? And that just doesn't work because it doesn't address the basic fundamental issues. All right, so the more material ways in which the PRC has attempted to address the different nature, the colonial issues of Xinjiang has been through, broadly speaking, two policy trajectories, one of which is development, the other is diversity management. And the argument here is a reasonable one. Developing the region can, of course, make people happier to be part of the PRC. It can reduce dissent that way. It can also reduce the costs of management of the region. And so, it's a good thing to try to do. And then the other approach has been through diversity management. And this, of course, is one corner of ethnicity policies or the Minzu policies all across the PRC. The famous identification of 55 minority Minzu along with the Han, the celebration at some periods of that difference. To use our contemporary vocabulary, we could see this as really a multicultural policy or kind of a form of diversity management, diversity regime that has been at some periods, in particular the 1950s and 1980s in China, really very liberal and open, at least on paper, and in kind of public expressions of inclusiveness of non-Han peoples, but without challenging their ethnic difference, right? And so, you can't get more inclusive than putting people on the currency, putting people on the stamps, putting people on the Spring Festival television gala show, right? And it's very easy as a Westerner to look at that and see its kitschiness, which it is. And certainly in the 2008 Olympics, when minority people, when children, mainly Han children, were dressed up as minorities and paraded around in that display of diversity, that got some sort of criticism, from international bodies saying that it was cultural co-optation and so on. But by the same token, that is a kind of state celebration of diversity, and very, very different from denial of diversity or attempts to assimilate it out of existence. And we've seen both, both extremes in China, and now we're very much at a assimilationist extreme. Now, kind of inherent in certain ways, not separate from either development or diversity approaches, is the settler colonialism approach to development, but also as a form of trying to deal with ethnic difference, right? Because if you can flood the zone with people from the metropole, then that, of course, arguably can, or from point of view of authorities, can help secure the region, secure the frontier. But of course, it also exacerbates the problem by creating a sense, precisely a sense that one is being flooded. Okay, so I'll talk both about development and about the ethnic policies in a little bit more detail, but still in a very kind of broad outline way. All right, so very, very broadly sketched from, in the 1950s, the Uyghur region was really tied to the USSR. And at that point, actually, Uyghur was transliterated into Cyrillic script. That's just one symbolic example of this. The USSR was investing in oil production in northern Xinjiang, and they got a cut of that. That all ended, of course, after the Sino-Soviet split. And for the next roughly 20 years, the region was pretty much left as a strategic buffer. There wasn't much development there. Of course, there are other things going on all over China, which slowed down development. But again, one emblematic aspect of that, and this is something I experienced in 1990, is that for all that time, the railway going from Lanzhou in Gansu out to Urumqi, and this is the only rail line, it was single track, single line, so that the eastbound train had to pull over onto a siding to let the westbound train go by. And it took 24 hours or something like that to make that trip, if not more. More like 48, I guess, yeah. So I've been that, some of this audience might have as well. It's a steam train. And there was no train all the way to Kashgar until 1999. And again, that's telling. Incidentally, in 1899, the author Jules Verne wrote an adventure story about a trip all the way across Eurasia on a new train line. And this was science fiction when Jules Verne wrote it at the end of the 19th century. And his train line went all the way from the Caspian Sea through Kashgar all the way to Beijing. So he imagined 100 years before, thinking about the kind of cutting edge or new technology of the 19th century. He imagined this, and it wasn't really for a century until that train was actually built there. Okay, so in 2000, Xinjiang was a big part of the Shibu Dakaifa program, the Great Development of the West. And some of the economists who've looked back on that program have criticized it in regard to Xinjiang for focusing on resource extraction, on building of transportation, which has been very useful and has led to other kind of multiplier effects, but generally for neglecting the poorer parts of Xinjiang, particularly the rural south. So from Kashgar to Hotan and around in that area in particular, where most of the Uyghurs are concentrated. And for neglecting human capital investment in favor of brick and mortar and big projects. And one sign of this, emblematic example of this, that was pointed out by the Uyghur economist Ilham Tohti, in his writings about this before he was arrested for separatism and given a life sentence. He was an economist at Minzu. But he pointed out that the lack of public education in the countryside in Xinjiang, or for free public education, meant that poor farmers were forced to decide between educating children or just bringing them back onto the farm to work. And so this really limited the ability of poor rural Uyghurs to learn Chinese at a level which would allow them to participate in the market and be entrepreneurs and so on. And also restricted education of girls in particular. I guess this is a problem in other parts of China as well. I don't know about the education system generally. But this is very relevant in Xinjiang, given the argument of the PRC state that so-called vocational training schools, coerced education is necessary given the fact that people are ignorant. Right? They haven't provided free education up until very recently. And then since 2010, there's been the counterpart assistance program, or the pairing or partner assistance program. And this began to be amplified after the Urumqi events of 2009. And this is a very interesting, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but a very interesting echo of the Qing period, because rather than providing assistance and directly from the central government in Beijing, this calls on 19 rich provinces and municipalities of eastern parts of the PRC to create direct relationships with sister counties and cities in Xinjiang, and to allocate a small percentage of the rich provinces' annual revenue to Xinjiang development, and also send out consultants and plan group projects to round up companies to invest, and so on. And so this has been, program has been critiqued as well for having many of the same kind of mistakes that big development projects around the world have often had, being project-based, being top-down, for insufficient consultation with local people about what they really need. And in particular, if you're asking Shenzhen to go help develop Kashgar, well, Shenzhen has been very, very good at developing Shenzhen, right? With a combination of, an export-led model and investment coming in from Hong Kong and elsewhere, building industrial parks, commercial free trade zones, and so on. And that's what Shenzhen has tried to do in Kashgar. But there have been news stories recently about some of these new developments, these trade cities and so on, becoming ghost towns within a couple of years of their construction in Kashgar, because the conditions are just not the same there. And so that's been one of the problems of this. Yuhui Li has written a really good book about this program in Xinjiang, which gets into a lot of the data. Now, more recently, though, one of the results of this partnership program is that it has connected the eastern provinces and cities, and then the companies that they have brought in, often their own local, Guangzhou companies or Beijing-based companies. They've brought them in. They are now directly connected to local administrations and to securitization and this whole carceral regime. And many of the factories in which we first identified Uyghur forced labor were in fact factories built by eastern provinces and cities in the new industrial zones in Xinjiang, which were constructed since 2010 under this assistance program. And factories run by, again, companies, eastern companies that were corralled into this whole thing by their local authorities back east. And so this has really created a huge tangled mess with regard to the tainting of supply chains. And again, I'll get to this in a moment, and the tainting of really anything to do with factory labor in Xinjiang. You start following these threads through, you'll see that responsible parties behind some of these factories aren't only based in Xinjiang, but they're also based in Guangzhou and Shenzhen and Beijing and the whole 19 of them. So it's really a mess that has been created by embroiling these partners, the sister cities and sister provinces, entangling them in the carceral regime in Xinjiang. Let's see. I'm gonna make sure I don't talk too long. All right. So related to this is the issue of the Bingtuan, or the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps, or as we probably should translate it, the Xinjiang Production Construction Soldier Corps. There's another term that's used, the big AI database system in Xinjiang now. The acronym is IJOP, Integrated Joint Operations Platform. But that word operations is, in Chinese, it's 作战. So it's military operations platform. So we drop the military and the soldier out of this. So I'm putting it back into this Xinjiang Production Construction Corps. In any case, this is a very interesting organization. It's like a state within a state, a kind of state-owned enterprise on steroids within Xinjiang. It's independent of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Regional Government and answers only to the party. It was established in 1949 and 1950 as a way to deal with 80,000 Kuomintang troops who were stranded there when the Kuomintang surrendered. And so they were settled there on the model of old Han Dynasty Twintian, and made, soldier militia farmers. They were given wives brought out from Shanghai. Someone once told me that Shanghai prostitutes who were arrested for rehabilitation were shipped out to Xinjiang to marry Kuomintang people, which of course gave you a really good class background, unfortunately. Then I'm not sure how, I haven't seen that documented anywhere, but it does make a certain amount of sense. And so on the model of Twintian, these militia were meant to settle the region, to open up its agriculture. And I'm quoting here from Bao Yajun, a man from the organization department, who was embedded with the Bingtuan in 2010 for a year and wrote a big study about it. And there's a couple articles that have come out in English from this. It's a really revealing study with a lot of calls for reform of the Bingtuan, which would be important to look at, I think now. Xi Jinping, the Bingtuan has been sort of anomalous. There were Bingtuan in other parts of China, also peripheral areas, all of which have been dissolved. In the Cultural Revolution, the Bingtuan was particularly violent and a source of instability in Xinjiang. A lot of the members see themselves in a very strongly nationalistic way as defending the frontier, as sort of the bulwark of China against barbarism. And they get quite heated about this, as they did in the Cultural Revolution. So the Bingtuan was actually dissolved after the Cultural Revolution, and then reinstated in the 1980s, I believe. In his recent speech in September to the third Xinjiang Work Forum, Xi Jinping reiterated party support for the Bingtuan in a kind of interesting phrase, to strengthen its organizational advantage and mobilization ability, so that it may be better able to achieve its special function, a special function which he didn't define, but which everyone knows is basically protecting the frontier, right? One arm on the pickaxe, one hand on the pickaxe, one hand on the gun has been their slogan. So this organization built its state farms very often on the best land. They got the river headwaters in the Tarim Basin, so they get first crack at runoff water coming out of the mountains, leaving what's left for Uyghur farmers. They've been more recently highly involved in city building new settlements. They've gone into all sorts of industry, construction materials, and so on. They now apparently, the recent study, they have many subsidiaries and shell companies all over the world, which the kind of financial forensic folks are just beginning to sort of understand. But they still run at a huge loss. And many people think, wow, so much money has been invested in Xinjiang. Why are the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others, not grateful? So much has been poured into it, because really much of what has been poured into Xinjiang has been poured into the Bingtuan, and not diversified to local peoples. So something like 80 or 90% of their budget comes from the center. This is according to Bao Yajun study in the 2010s. they have a huge overhead of pensioners because the people that they brought out and settled, they promised pensions, they promised education, they promised healthcare. And so they're paying for a population of 2.8 million with only 700,000 productive employees. This is a couple years old, but I don't think anything has really changed in the general ratio there. So this is really ironically akin to the Manchu banner system, which became a really heavy burden on the Qing Empire when there were so many bannerman dependents who had to be supported in order to maintain military viability for the banner. So it's a similar problem with any kind of colonial organization, right, of occupation. Now, one of the kind of interesting and most targeted and potentially most effective directions of this recent sort of flurry of sanctions, which the US government has applied to China in regard to the Xinjiang situation, most interesting ones are directed at the Bingtuan. This relatively little known organization has shown up in several of these listings and these sanctions. The Public Security Bureau of the Bingtuan was on the first entities list listing. Bingtuan officials have been sanctioned through the Global Magnitsky Law. The huge Eskel Group, which is a huge wholesale manufacturer, vertically integrated wholesale manufacturer of clothing, they have they grow cotton or buy cotton from farmers directly in Xinjiang, and then take it all the way up the chain to producing garments, which are then internationally marketed under international fashion brands. All the biggest names, Tommy Hilfiger and so on and so forth. So they had a joint partnership with a subsidiary of the Xinjiang Production Construction Corps until, I believe, 2019. When they dissolved it. And they say they dissolved it because there was changes of their, in the way in which they were supplying cotton, I believe is their reason. I've suggested maybe they saw the writing on the wall that it would not be useful to continue to be in bed with the Bingtuan, but you can look on their website and actually see how they explain this. It's my speculation that was their reason. But that was, Eskel Group was also listed on this Bureau of Industry and Security entities list by the US. Now that's very interesting because, this entities list it's export control entities. And the entities there are those that are subject to special review when they want to, when someone wants to export particular technology to those entities. So I don't believe there's anything that Eskel technologically needs that might be exported from the United States. Someone suggested perhaps robotics, maybe so, but they're in the business of spinning cotton, making textiles, making apparel. So the US is using the entities list, I think, to name and shame here. And it's interesting that they singled out Eskel for this. Just last week, there's a much broader ban has been put in place. The CBP issued a detention order or withhold release order, and the Customs and Border Patrol will detain all cotton and cotton products, including textiles, originating with the Bingtuan in Xinjiang. It used to be just concerns about Xinjiang. Now they're singling out the Bingtuan as well. How exactly one is going to determine that, given the fact that cotton goes into everything and is spread out through supply chains, that's an interesting question. Xinjiang produces 85% of China's cotton now. And this has been the culmination of a movement of cotton growing and also cotton spinning from Eastern China into Xinjiang over the last 20 years. It's been progressively increasing, doubling down on Xinjiang as sort of the cotton bowl of China has been clearly a policy. And perhaps also cotton or lower level processing of cotton and production of cotton products and textiles in general, one could also argue has been moving out to Xinjiang as well, perhaps as part of this process of chasing remaining cheap labor sort of deeper and deeper into the PRC hinterland as the stock of peasant girls willing to work for very little in factories in the East, is depleted. So there seems to have been a policy to kind of move all of this further and further out into Xinjiang. So 85% of China's cotton comes from Xinjiang. We don't know how much of that, or I haven't found the figures. Perhaps they could be found by tabulating and comparing different statistical yearbooks. But we don't know exactly how much of that is grown by the Bingtuan, but the Bingtuan itself claims to grow a lot of it. It certainly probably both buys up supply grown from communes or from independent growers and processes that. It also grows its own on these huge state farms. Mechanized cotton harvesting in Xinjiang using the most advanced harvesters, which now can harvest cotton in a way that maintains high quality. It used to be until quite recently that hand-picked cotton was of better quality because automated harvesting would break up the fibers. Now they've got the most advanced harvesting, and they advertise it as one of their great comparative advantages here. This is, the XPCC, right? So it's claiming it's reaching new heights in the harvest of cotton. I think this is from 2019, perhaps 2018, 2019, yeah. So some large amount of Xinjiang's cotton comes from the Bingtuan, and that, of course, is a large amount of China's own 85% of cotton. China also imports cotton from outside to use in clothing. So I don't know how exactly all of this is going to be, sorted out. But what the regime in Xinjiang has now done has really implicated the Bingtuan, and with it all of Xinjiang, and with it potentially all of these partners in this whole regime with the camps and forced labor and birth suppression and everything else. And the Bingtuan is still recruiting people from Eastern China, advertising education, housing, guaranteed high salary jobs for people with native registration and good political character. All right, so it's almost 1:20. I want to leave time for.
Well, Jim, one of the first questions I would like to ask is, why do you think in 2017 there was this kind of added new push? What were the circumstances that led to that push at that time?
So I think so. Two things. One, obviously, I haven't talked about terrorism yet. In 2013 and 14, there were 4 events which are clearly jihadi style attacks on civilians to make a political point. We don't know a great deal about it, and that includes the Kunming attacks, 2 attacks in Urumqi, and then this Beijing vehicular assault. There's some weird things about some of them. We'd like to know more than we do, but simply from seeing what happened, I'm comfortable calling those terrorism. But contrary to very widespread belief, and widespread belief in the think tank world and outside of China as well, much of what else has been going on I would categorize as unrest rather than as terrorism. A lot of it involves the police. A lot of it comes out of police action, going into people's houses, looking for Korans or taking veils off of women, or chasing down groups of people who are praying in the desert. A lot of it seems to be mass incidents, not that different from the kind of mass incidents that we are told there's tens of thousands of in the rest of China every year, right? Villagers upset at a local policy, land appropriation, appropriation of pension funds, environmental damage. So they converge on the local government office or family planning issues. And then things get very, very violent. And the difference between how these issues are treated in Eastern China and how they're treated in Xinjiang is that in Xinjiang, everything is terrorism. And the police shoot first, as they did in the Urumqi in 2010, excuse me, 2009 in Urumqi, the demonstrations there, they were violently repressed in a way which not even Tiananmen or certainly Hong Kong recently have been violently repressed immediately, that is, on the very day of the first demonstration, right? But that's what happens in Xinjiang because of this terrorism label. So in 2013, 2014, there were these events. The entire issue of Uyghur nationalism had been characterized since the early 2000s as one of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. And that branding and approach still applied because unrest of all kinds was continuing. Xi Jinping transferred Chen Quanguo from Tibet, where he was known for having stabilized the situation through various kinds of policies, including grid policing and other things like that. And so he was transferred over in 2016 and right away began implementing the policies that we've seen. So I would say, the proximate reasons is the continuing unrest in Xinjiang in the years before 2016, 2017. But the longer term reasons are that unrest was itself the result of increasingly oppressive approaches to Uyghur culture, really, which were triggered in turn by the events of 2009, the Urumqi riots and so on. So it's sort of this escalation, again, this repression, resistance, repression kind of cycle. And Xi Jinping, after coming into office, decided to do something about it. Now, I mean, there's an interesting angle on this, which I haven't really looked into, and I don't know, I mean, Ezra, maybe if you want to write another big biography of a Chinese. One interesting thing about Xi Jinping, his father, Xi
Jinping, yes.
Zhongjun, right,
Yeah.
was closely involved with the United Front and is known as someone who worked closely with the Tibetan people in particular, and is sympathetic to kind of indigenous Tibetan elites and others, and was someone who's well liked by Minzu. Now, so again, I'm speculating here with absolutely no evidence other than this, but if one wanted to go all kind of psychobiographical about this and to think about Xi Jinping's approach to ethnicity versus that of his father, maybe there's something there because I think one of the most notable things that Xi Jinping has done has been to push the idea of the Zhonghua Minzu, of a kind of super Minzu that all of its characteristics are those of Han Chinese, but that everyone really should follow in on. So in addition to the Xinjiang policies, there's the so-called anti-Arabization or the Sinicization of religion policies, which again are literally going around knocking down domes and replacing them with Chinese-style roofs on mosques. There's been a big push to people to speak only Chinese in schools, including most recently in Inner Mongolia. Why are they pursuing that particularly right now, given all of the international criticism that the PRC is getting for Xinjiang policies? It would seem to be just kind of asking for more trouble, and yet he does seem to be pursuing it. So he has been, there was this discussion really from the 2010s, and something which Mark Elliott has written about in his wonderful article on the search for the missing indigene in China. The so-called second generation Minzu policy. And in that discussion, there were sort of two sides. One was that the current Minzu policies were good. They needed actually to be fulfilled to the letter of the Constitution and various laws. And then there was a counter argument that no, that approach, the celebration of the different Minzu was in fact bolstering national divisions, and that China might break up like the Soviet Union had over those national divisions. And that debate went back and forth surprisingly openly in party journals, in anthropological literature, and so on. Xi Jinping, very early on in his tenure, weighed in at an ethnic work conference, and James Leibold has written about this, and didn't really come down directly in favor of the so-called second generation. or deterritorializationing. In other words, taking away the so-called autonomous regions of Xinjiang, Tibet, and so on. But the policies that he's implemented very much trend in that direction, and he has been very much pushing emphasis on a national study, on the national language. In Xinjiang now, the word for Chinese that is officially used is not Putonghua so much. It's not Hanhua, which many people used to use colloquially. It's Guoyu, right? The old term we used to know from Taiwan and in Singapore and so on. But they're using national language and national studies, and the nation, that sense of Guo is increasingly being defined by Xi Jinping along to fit a Han mold, right? Chinese mold. We should open up to some general questions. I don't want to get into people might have been seeing what I put up here, this thing about ETIM. There really was a big, mistake made by the Bush administration in agreeing to list this organization. Sean Roberts at George Washington University has a new book called The War on the Uyghurs. And he goes into all of the history of this. He's talked to Uyghur groups, he's talked to the supposed terrorist groups, and to some who really are violent people. And he untangles this very, very clearly. But the long and the short of it is, just a couple of weeks ago, so-called ETIM was officially delisted. And this was announced by Secretary Pompeo. And this is really a phenomenal admission on the part of the US that this was a mistake in the first place. But what's tragic about it is that this was a mistake, and particularly the use of Chinese language from the Chinese white paper. This US mistake created the sense that there was a unitary, international, organized terrorist organization responsible for everything that happened in Xinjiang. And literally the US statement said that. And so that has spawned 1,000 think tank studies ever since, which can look back to the US putting its imprimatur on PRC propaganda to say that there is such an organization when there really wasn't. There was not that kind of thing. So we're coming out of global war on terror as a framework in which we've seen this, and well overdue that this has happened. So maybe I think I've talked enough. There's more that I could say, but let me just leave this. I'll leave this screen up for a minute if you want to go to questions.
Yeah, one person who wants to ask a question is Paul here, who has been a national intelligence officer for many years working on China, and also worked for the Council of Foreign Relations. I wonder, Mark, if you could call on Paul here to let him ask the question himself. Paul, is that possible? If not, then I'll just read his question.
Yeah, I'm trying to promote him now.
Okay. Paul, does that work? Yeah, here he comes. Paul?
And he may be muted. Okay, there we go.
Okay, no, I didn't realize there was going to be the option here. Oh, the question was a very succinct one, and I think Dr. Millward, you addressed it in part. My question was basically, would it be correct to characterize Beijing's policy in Xinjiang as clearly an outrageously excessive overreaction to what is nonetheless a legitimate, however marginal, but real terrorist threat?
I think it's far, far more marginal than even reasonable people say. I mean, literally, we can point to those four events in 2013 and 2014. Before that, it was in the early 1990s. There were a couple of bus bombings, but really, it's been the dog that hasn't barked, and and again, this is a little unfair to point this out, but I think it's worthwhile that, the Kunming at the Kunming railway station, it was obviously a horrific event. 31 people were killed by 8 or 9 assailants. Exactly why they were there, though, it seems that they were trying to get out of China and were blocked at the border. This was in the middle of a movement when a lot of people were being smuggled out of China through Southeast Asia. So there's weird things about it. Nonetheless, a horrible event. But at almost around exactly that same time, a Han man on a bus in Fujian lit a can of kerosene on fire over an overpass and killed himself and 46 other people. And so, that's not treated as terrorism. None of these other mass incidents in the rest of China are treated as terrorism. And I think an awful lot of the unrest could be put down to the same kinds of problems that we see in other parts of China with local corruption and so on, as I said before. And I actually, and Sheila Greetins and co-authors have written an influential article recently where they say, they advocate sort of how we should talk about, the terrorism issue with China. And there's a lot that's really good in that article, and I've assigned it myself. But I think we're well beyond usefulness of terrorism as a framework for discussing it. The degree of the problem is very small, and they have a much larger other problem. Obviously, I'm not going to have a lot of fans in Beijing right away by calling it a colonial problem. With more time, and I'm actually thinking of writing something along these lines, I would want to compare it to other colonial issues, to other issues of racism, in the United States and with the United States, U.S. Expansion, European expansion across North America provides many very, very parallel situations. Canadian and U.S. Boarding schools and religious endeavors to convert Native peoples or First Nations to white ways. There are many, many very, very striking parallels. When we talk about the camps in Xinjiang and concentration camps, and people bridle at that word concentration camp, I think it's appropriate. The reference point shouldn't be the Holocaust so much as the first uses of concentration in Cuba and in South Africa, and frankly in the U.S. with Japanese Americans, putting a group in a state of exception, in Agamben's terms, on the basis of their ethnic identity, because they are seen on the basis of that ethnic or religious identity as a threat to society, therefore should not be treated with the same rights. That's precisely what's going on. And, the wheel has been reinvented in Xinjiang in recent terms. So that's why I use this kind of terminology. And I think, the terrorism frame has been very, very destructive for everything. And I think, frankly, it's very useful for China to hear from other voices that it's not terrorism they're dealing with, it's another kind of problem. So that's why I object quite strongly to, well, maybe it's a little problem. No, and they have so firmly overreacted to have illegalized aspects of mundane aspects of religious practice. Owning a Quran is effectively illegal, can get you put in the camps in Xinjiang. That's how far they've gone by following this terrorism frame. And it's time for, I think, for their own good and for the good of Xinjiang's exports and everything else, for all of our good, to kind of recognize that that's not the source of this problem.
Here's a question from Xavier Wisniewski. Said, I was wondering if you could address the Uyghur crisis, how it plays in international relations with China. And the fact that some multinational corporations seem to be hindering the efforts to address the problem. Nike and the US apparently lobbying against bills to address this situation. Seems morally dubious. So who are the people who are working on this issue? What do you think the next Biden administration might be able to do that would be helpful? That's my add on to the end.
Right. And it's all part of that bigger question. So, to get to start with the specifics, and then I'll broaden it out. The specifics are, Nike, Apple, Coca-Cola. It's recently been reported, and there might well be other companies, have been lobbying against a law that is moving through Congress now, a Uyghur forced labor law. There has been a law that did pass called the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. That law initially had forced labor provisions in it. It stalled in Congress, although it had strong bipartisan support in the middle of the Trump administration, as very little else did. It stalled in Congress, I think, because it was opposed by I've been told, by Secretary Mnuchin, and also from the White House, who believed that it could overturn efforts, it could hinder efforts to reach this massive trade deal with China, which is ironic because, of course, the billions in tariffs, hundreds of billions in tariffs, which the Trump administration put on, were a much more serious kind of economic problem. In any case, that human rights bill was held up. It eventually passed when they stripped out the labor provisions. So now a new bill with those labor provisions is working its way through. That's what the corporations are worried about, because it is very similar to what I just mentioned, the listing of the Bingtuan and the withhold release order. This could make a rebuttable presumption. In other words, it could put the onus on corporations wanting to import goods from China or Xinjiang or perhaps China more broadly, to prove that they have nothing to do with the Bingtuan or nothing to do with forced labor, as opposed to the onus being on anyone accusing them of being connected to forced labor. And obviously switching that burden of proof over to the importer is something that companies are very concerned about. But they're essentially, I somewhat sympathize with them, because for the reasons I just pointed out, and the reasons I went into this level of detail about the partnership assistance program, when you start looking, if you start pulling on some of these threads, you see how involved so many, hundreds, thousands of corporations, hundreds of local administrations, all of Xinjiang, the Bingtuan, and then now all of their Eastern partners in the partnership program are all involved in this. Everybody has been tainted by this. And so, and now increasingly international corporations are now having to worry about it. So I do sympathize with them, as I sympathize in particular with the Eskel group that I mentioned before. They were in Xinjiang 20 years ago. They were setting up factories, hiring Uyghur workers before any of this happened, and they've been embroiled in it too. So it's just a big mess that has been created by these policies, and the international corporations are upset by it too. I think it's important for the next administration, even as it should adjust its general China policies to avoid gratuitous provocations of China and to become much more strategic in the types of actions that it takes. I don't think the Trump China policy overall has been chaotic and very, very mixed. But I think these targeted approaches, Magnitsky sanctions, these kinds of entities listings, particularly when they've been able to, frankly, scare the monkey to kill the chickens or scare the chicken to kill the monkeys, I can never remember which, it's causing reverberations through the entire global apparel industry. And it's being picked up, and young people in making their fashion consuming choices are aware of this. This is a way to apply real pressure, which is much, much better than Secretary Pompeo wagging his finger. And I think points out the fundamental problems and should encourage China to try to resolve them. Whereas if these issues are dealt with purely politically, without paying attention to the global commercial aspects of them, then the Xinjiang and the issue of Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and other native peoples in Xinjiang, that simply becomes another thing that the US and China yell at each other about. And the whataboutism comes into this, and so on and so forth. So I support, I hope the Biden administration will continue this kind of careful, targeted, well-researched sanctioning of corporate and political entities that are involved with this, even though they're going to get pushback from global corporations that find this very inconvenient.
I wonder if you want to add a little more. If the Biden administration were wise enough to come to you and say what we should do about the Xinjiang problem, in addition to that targeted program for dealing with businesses, do you have an overall, perspective, or how would you deal with some of the Uyghur dissidents that come to the United States, and how would you approach China on these issues?
So Uyghur, I don't know how many Uyghur dissidents have ever come to the United States. Some become dissidents when they're here. I suppose some have, but mainly what we have right now is not a large number, but we have exiles or refugees who have not been able to go back since all of this, since their family members started being interned and incarcerated. So I think an easy step and a good step to make, and one that is beneficial for the United States in many ways, would be to speed up the asylum process, or to give a kind of amnesty to Uyghurs who are left high and dry in the United States because of all of this. Again, I don't know the absolute numbers. It can't be more than a few hundred, but the analogy to this is what the US did after the Tiananmen events for Chinese students, some of whom, as I recall, were given a kind of amnesty from immigration concerns. So I think that would be a good first step. Many Uyghurs have been trying to work their way through the immigration system. Many have not wanted to claim asylum, but they've had no choice. And they've been stymied simply because the Trump administration has understaffed and has just thrown a spanner in the works for all of that. So there have been people who've been waiting for years for an initial interview that the websites, the US Immigration Service websites, say you will get within 2 weeks. There's still people who haven't gotten that. So anyway, that's an easy one, I think, which could be done. It won't please Beijing, but that's, I think, these are mainly professionals, speak many languages. It's a good thing. More broadly, though, I think continuing these sort of targeted policies, but the U.S. really needs to, for its foreign policy in general, try to recover, or recover may not even be the right word, but try to establish to treat these issues with some humility, given our own problems with regard to racism at home, with regard to xenophobic policies, the sort of make America first approach of the Trump administration has really eroded a lot of US credibility internationally over these issues. And so to suddenly come right back and start lecturing other countries about their diversity issues is probably not the most practical way to do it. Unfortunately, how do you do this? It's an urgent situation with people literally in camps and being in forced labor situation. I think some humility and recognition, and maybe even beginning to discuss why the West is so appalled by what's going on in Xinjiang. Not just by analogy, as I said before, to the Holocaust, which I think is not really the good analogy, but analogy to treatment of indigenous peoples in our own history, and kind of gently pointing out these parallels, and to show that this is seen as a great failure in our nations, in our societies. It's a failure globally. The legacies of colonialism, as the Black Lives Matter movement has shown, really resonate and are of great concern, particularly to young people all over the world. That was actually very moving to me to see the global echoes of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States following the death of George Floyd, to see them in France and UK and Australia and even I think Japan and so So this is a global issue, right? And so China now has been perpetrating some of these same kinds of sins of colonialism. Our hands are not clean, but we do have experience in this and experience of regret of this. And you know, celebration of diversity is something which the first generation Minzu policies, you know, in the 1950s, with its internationalist, kind of Marxist, but internationalist approach to the idea of the nation, the PRC came up with a really interesting, not the same as, you know, liberal democracies did, but an interesting approach to a diversity regime, one which we, you know, I think many other countries could learn from. And so recognizing that in 1950s, you were better off as a minority in China than you would have been in the United States, you know, might be a kind of place to start this conversation. So maybe this isn't something necessarily which, you know, diplomats can do around the table in their first meetings, but I think it could be part of a broader society to society conversation, and that you know, might help kind of explain where we're coming from on this and why it's such a bad idea to pursue those policies in Xinjiang.
I have to apologize for so many people who've asked questions. I've been slow in scrolling down, but one question from Ambassador Stapleton Roy. Can you say a few words about separatism in Xinjiang? And then the final question, unfortunately, Mark Elliott had to run to a meeting, but this is the question from Mark Elliott. So if you could address these two questions as the final comments. And here's what Mark said. We can readily see the move toward policies in Xinjiang that are more aggressively assimilationist. And as you say, the shift has been couched mainly in terms of counterterrorism or poverty amelioration. Have you seen any evidence of a broader shift in nationalities policy in China as Minzu Tuanjie? Is it now being reinterpreted to Minzu Ronghe or assimilation, or some similar redefinition of the Zhonghua Minzu? Are we seeing a questioning of the model of Duoyan Yiti established by Fei Xiaotong that has been in place for 40 years? So those two questions for your final comments.
Yeah, okay. So on the issue of separatism, you know, just the other day I was reading an otherwise, you know, good news account, and in that, you know, kind of basic explanatory paragraph that so many articles, you know, have to have, you know, it said something like, you know, separatists have been waging a long-term campaign to achieve autonomy in Xinjiang, or to achieve independence for Xinjiang. You know, statements like that are quite commonplace. But if you actually think about it, we have absolutely no evidence of that. We have no evidence of why any of this unrest happens, right? We are not, we are told endlessly by PRC propaganda that it's due to the three evils of separatism, extremism, and terrorism. They're blending together religious motivations with nationalistic motivations, as if they're, you know, they're inseparable. And I think there's an argument to be made for nationalistic desires in addition to, or maybe even more than, religious motivations. But I actually only realized this myself the other day. We have very little evidence of even separatist impulses. We really don't. You know, there aren't writings. There are people outside of China who want to have an independent East Turkestan organization, or East Turkestan Republic, but all the main exile Uyghur political groups, the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur America Association, the most influential ones, renounced their open calls for independence, or dropped them some time ago, in return for being able to function as mainstream advocacy organizations, working with the EU, working with the US government, in Australia and other places like this. And they, you know, their concerns now are for protection of the people, for cultural autonomy, for cultural preservation, those kind of things, as with Tibet as well. So there really is nobody who is, except for very small numbers of Uyghurs outside of China, who is calling for an independent East Turkestan. And we have no evidence that there's any, and as I said before, there is no group that is pursuing this. There is no organized international group of any size. There's definitely nothing that is organized within Xinjiang that's doing this. So I think, obviously there are, I think, people are angry, people are concerned, people are terrified about what the Chinese state might do. There's great interests in preserving Uyghur culture. And I think now, after what's going on, I think many people say the only way in which Uyghurs can be safe is if they're free of the Chinese Communist Party. I wouldn't be surprised that those sentiments have spread over the last few years. But I think before we talk about, it's one of these things we've taken taken for granted without actually looking at it, that there is a separatist movement behind this. So as for Mark Elliott's question, has there been signs of a shift towards, away from unity of the nationalities to mingling or even fusing of the nationalities? And Mark obviously knows the answer to this question. I can tell from the way he asked it, that there has been. The rhetoric has shifted, and he's more expert on this than me, having done this work, studied this. But the rhetoric has shifted in significant ways, and we've seen this in Xi Jinping's speeches at various ethnic work forums and so on. One thing that really struck me from the most recent, and this hasn't really been picked up that much in the press, but the most recent Xinjiang, it was a Xinjiang work forum held in September. I referenced it in my talk. She repeated a phrase which has been in some earlier political announcements as well, that's saying that the bloodlines of all the nationalities in Xinjiang are linked to those of the Zhonghua Minzu. So he used this with xuemai, right? So, and this is as far as I can tell. I searched that phrase and I found it coming up here and there over the past couple of years, but not before that. But this seems to be hinting even at this racialist argument of unity, right? It's not the Fei Xiaotong kind of anthropological argument that the various peoples have come together and through their combined efforts and labor and aspirations, will give birth to the Zhonghua Minzu as a kind of super identity. That's what kind of Fei Xiaotong's Doryuan Iti, many origins, one essence, one substance, one body. That's his argument. This is different from that. This is more akin to what Chiang Kai-shek argued in China's Destiny, that all the peoples of China, and his peoples were divided into 5, the Manchus, the Mongols, the Muslims, the Han, and the Tibetans. But he said all of them came from the same stock, all were scions of the Yellow Emperor. They just deviated from the core, from the root stock because of historical and geographical regions, but they really were all the same people. So he was thinking these racial terms. So Xi Jinping introducing this term bloodline, so maybe that's just kind of a way of putting it, but it does seem to add this kind of racialist sense to it. And certainly arguments that Uyghur language is actually Chinese, that the Uyghurs are not descended from the Turkic Khaganate, but rather from ancient Zhonghua Minzu, the increasing treatment of Zhonghua Minzu as a historical entity rather than as an ideological artifact, which we see across the board in these statements, is likewise pushing towards this kind of racialized notion of a inherent Chinese group. And of course, whenever you see what are the characteristics of this Zhonghua Minzu, they celebrate Chinese New Year. They speak Northern Mandarin, and they are very loyal to the Chinese Communist Party, right? So that's part of this statist cult. And this might be, we were talking before about the biography of Xi Jinping. I think this ties it together. This ties the China Dream together, his kind of Confucianistic approach, the efforts to create a state-focused ideology, and how minorities, or so-called Xiaoshu Minzu in China, seems to challenge that homogeneous vision of a loyal Chinese identity, Zhonghua identity.
Jim, we're very grateful for you taking the time and sharing your extremely deep, broad knowledge and thought and sympathy and understanding of what's going on in a very broad way. And we're very pleased that finally you have been willing to help us understand the issues related to Uyghurs. So thank you very, very much for your.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thanks to everybody who joined in. I wish I could have seen your faces at least, but thanks for sticking with me while I sort of rambled on so
You
long.
didn't ramble. You informed us. Thanks a lot, Jim. Bye-bye.
Thank you.